Which one's the best crypto asset? Well, Bitcoin's the best crypto asset. Okay. What's the second best? There is no second best. There is no second best crypto asset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show. I'm your host, Dale Warburton. It's a weekly podcast on why Bitcoin matters and what makes it completely different to all other cryptocurrencies. If you're interested in Bitcoin and you'd like to distill crypto fact from fiction, you've come to the right place.
All right. So, everyone, I have got Luke Mikic with me all the way from Colombia. Welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show, Luke.
Thanks for having me, brother. I am pumped to be talking to not quite a fellow Australian, but somebody who has a little bit of an Australian accent in them. So I'm glad to be here, brother.
Thanks for that, man. Close enough, hey? I'll work on the Aussie accent just a tad. So, Luke, I think just for the sake of those who perhaps haven't followed your fascinating journey from Australia to Central America and South America, won't you please give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and then perhaps also then touch on your Bitcoin journey? How did you come into this world of Bitcoin?
Okay, so we'll do the boring part of my journey first, and we'll talk about my rabbit hole story before we get to the adventures. So I was 19 when I first heard about Bitcoin. I was studying a double major in maths and chemistry at university in 2017, and then I heard about Bitcoin when it was around $10,000 or $20,000 a pop. And I went down the proverbial rabbit hole pretty quick and pretty deep. I can remember there's about a 2 to 3 week stage there where I couldn't sleep for about 2 or 3 weeks on end because I was just thinking about Bitcoin all night, every night. I was listening to Max Kaiser and Andreas Antonopoulos before I went to bed every night at like 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning. So I got pretty heavily orange pilled, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to go back to this university thing. It sounds like a waste of time. I need to try to free up my time to learn as much about Bitcoin as I possibly could. So then I thought, okay, I'm going to quit university. I started a personal training business. So I kind of started a home gym. I went and bought a heap of secondhand gym equipment, and I just started training clients because I had my certificate in fitness. So I did the personal training gig for a couple of years between 2018 and 2020, just because I only had to give 2 or 3 hours a day to that. And I had enough money to live on so I could learn about Bitcoin. So I continued going down the rabbit hole. And then 2020 came along, and I thought, hey, my friends and family won't listen to me. They just think I'm a nutcase talking about Bitcoin and macroeconomics. I might start making some videos and trying to educate other people online about it. So I started making some videos in 2020. I was very vocally calling out the mandates and all of the quote unquote health decisions that were occurring in 2020. So I'm pretty proud of those receipts I've got on YouTube, even though a lot of those videos got deleted. Yeah. But that part of my journey was what inspired me to actually leave Australia. It was obviously the international borders were closed for a couple of years there. And long story short, I finally escaped Australia in early 2022. And the only reason I was allowed to leave was because I was lucky enough to get a job, a couple of Bitcoin jobs online. And one of them was working with Mark Moss, who has a pretty large and successful YouTube channel. So he had to hand write me a letter. They got shown to the Australian government, and they had to give me permission to leave my own country. So yeah, that's
lucky boy.
The long version of my rabbit hole story.
Wow, Luke, that's really fascinating, man. And I think it sort of mirrors what a lot of us Bitcoiners go through, is that when we first encounter this and the penny drops, it's just this obsessive rabbit hole mission. And I too did a similar thing. I went and spent hours and hours just diving as deep as I possibly could, watching hours of videos, and even went so far as to write a whole thesis on it. So I can totally resonate with that sort of obsessive nature. And what a ballsy move, sort of at your age, packing it up and going offshore. I'd love to talk about that a little later, but let's start at a very high level, because you mentioned Mark Moss, and that's when I actually first saw you. And I was like, how has this fella managed to get connected with such a well-known figure? And it was just, so that's an incredibly interesting story. I'd love to hear how you managed to connect with Mark Moss, and as you've described, then managed to escape Australia.
Yeah, escape is the correct kind of phrase. So I think I did the YouTube channel in 2020, and then I started getting a little bit more serious in 2021. Because for the 2018, 2019 kind of era of my Bitcoin journey, I was still shitcoining, I was trading, I was buying stocks. I had a heap of precious metal like gold, physical gold and silver, because I thought the economic system was going to collapse. It wasn't until around 2020, 2021 that I was properly orange pilled by a fellow Australian Bitcoiner, actually, Armin the Parman. He's a technical wizard and a champion. But anyway, so I wrote my first article in 2021, and I just published it on Medium, and then I got a DM one day from Mark, and I nearly fell off my chair because I just thought it was a fake account. But I clicked on his profile, it was the real Mark, and he said, "Hey, I like what you're writing. You want to come write for me?" And I was like, "Hell yes, dude! I've watched your videos for a couple of years now, because obviously been a long time fan, and I listen to a lot of Mark's content, as well as content like George Gammon's and other macroeconomic content like Lynn Alden and Luke Groman. I'd listened to them for the whole 2020, 2021 era. So yeah, I jumped at it. It was an amazing opportunity. And yeah, I mean, he was the one who wrote me the letter that got me out of Australia. And then since then, I've picked up a number of different roles with Bitcoin only companies in the space over the past year or so now. So now I'm lucky enough to be working full time with Coin Beast. We're a Bitcoin only educational company, and I'm running their YouTube channel, podcast, Twitter. So you'll see a lot of my economic ramblings and rants on our Money Matters YouTube channel.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so interesting, because it sounds like we were basically had the same playlist. Although I don't know if you've noticed that George Gammon seems to have deviated somewhat and is trying to create his own crypto of sorts. Have you seen that lately? Like he's someone I really admired, and then he's sort of, I think he's in Puerto Rico and trying to create some sort of gold-backed crypto. Have you come across that yet?
I believe that would actually be George's very good friend, Peter Schiff, who's making the gold-backed crypto. As it turns out, I'm actually renting an apartment with George Gammon's research assistant, who I met through Mark. So I see George on the regular, and if he's making a crypto, I'm gonna put it to him. I'm gonna ask him all about that.
I'm totally aware of old Schiff, because he's even gone down the NFT rabbit hole now. But I'll try and find that. I found a tweet recently, but yeah, perhaps I'm speaking out of turn here. So let's go back to sort of the macro stuff, because you touched on all my sort of macro heavyweight heroes, if you like, the likes of Lynn and Luke Groman. Talk to me a little bit about your macro framework, because it's a pinned tweet there that you've got there, and I don't expect you to kind of run through it from top to bottom, but just at a high level, describe the way that you've looked at Bitcoin and its potential total addressable market. And I guess for the sake of listeners who aren't familiar with total addressable market, perhaps you can just touch on what that term means too.
Yeah, so a total addressable market is what is the potential market share that this asset could capture. So obviously gold, that's like money. So it can capture potentially the entire world's wealth if it wants to be stored in money. So I believe Bitcoin is money, and it has the largest total addressable market cap of all time. Today, there's $900 trillion of wealth in the world. And that's actually, if you ignore the $2 quadrillion of derivatives out there, because I don't count any of that garbage. So yeah, when I'm looking at the macro framework, I always like to zoom out. I think that's where most people go wrong, because they're looking at the yield curve, they're looking at all these recession indicators, they're saying, hey, a recession's coming, I should buy bonds. But I believe we're actually in a decade where the rules have changed, and the past 40 years of economic data no longer applies for the 2020s era, because I actually believe 2020 was kind of like an inflection point. So if you look back throughout history, it's pretty clear and it's pretty abundant that the world today has too much debt. So there's a really cool hedge fund. They go by the name of Hirschman Capital. And in 2020, they did a report and they said, hey, since the year 1800, there's been 52 countries who have reached debt to GDP levels of 130% or higher. And they said 51 of those countries ended up defaulting on that debt within 15 years of reaching that 130% debt Rubicon. So, that's 250 years of economic data. And it's really interesting that the United States hit a debt to GDP ratio of 139% in 2020. So by economic data, and there is a 98.5% chance that the global reserve hegemon defaults on its debt within 10 to 15 years. So that is my macro framework. I say, okay, the global reserve currency is going to default within 15 years. There's a 98% probability of it. And it's really interesting that there's another 14 countries around the world who have also surpassed 130% debt to GDP ratios. So I believe we are in a decade where governments are simply going to have to print money, devalue the money, and pay back that debt with the devalued dollars. That is what every single one of those 51 countries actually chose to do in their kind of times of default over the past 250 years. That's actually not entirely correct. Not every single country. The large majority of them choose to print the money, devalue the money, and pay back the debt with the devalued dollars. And so I believe right now, the macro consensus is, central banks are raising interest rates. They're going to kill inflation. Inflation ran up to 9% in the US, and now it's down at like 4.5% when you use the very manipulated government-approved CPI inflation metric. And most people think we're going back to like this era of 0% inflation. And I've been screaming from the rooftops saying, no, it's not possible. It's not only not possible, but the governments actually need inflation to inflate away their debt. So I think for the rest of this decade, you're going to watch an era where the inflation rates are actually higher than the government interest rates. And what that's going to do is it's going to devalue the debt that the government has. And we've already seen that over the past 3 years. US government debt to GDP peaked out at 139% in 2020. Today, it's down in the 120s. And most people think, the government's doing a great job. They're taming inflation. But when in reality, the government's actually let inflation run far hotter than their interest rates over the past 3 years. And they've shrunk their debt just a little bit from 139 to 122 or whatever it is today. I could rant and rave a lot more. I'm a little bit of a macro nerd, but I'll pause there and let you get a word in.
Yeah, that's an amazing summary, man. And I think just to sort of clarify for those who perhaps aren't familiar with the different kinds of default, I mean, you've got the hard default and the soft default. You're referring largely there to the soft default where you just print your way out of it. The hard default is obviously in the case of the likes of Argentina, where they just say they can't print their US dollars. So they'll just go, hey guys, we don't have any money. But in the case of the US, that's obviously not going to happen. So they'll just print their way out of it. And then the other thing you're sort of touching on there is we're likely to be going into this decade of financial repression, where real interest rates are actually below the so-called official inflation rate. And so that's what's quite funny is that even though when we look at inflation, we say to ourselves, like, this is not a real metric by any stretch of the imagination. It's completely and utterly manipulated. In fact, from the early 70s, it has very little resemblance to it. One of the most egregious I find is that reference to the homeowner's equivalent in rent, as opposed to what the actual cost of housing is, because it's so artificial, it's frightening. And you think to yourself, what's clearly happened over the last, call it 3 years, is asset holders have been able to effectively have their bags pumped at the expense of the poor chumps who've been diligently saving. And now those assets are, in the case of equity, sitting at PE ratios north of 20 and 30, which is historically really high. You've got property markets, particularly in the developed nations like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, where people who had the ability to borrow at 2%, it was the perfectly rational thing to do. So you do end up in this situation where some people feel like it doesn't matter how fast they swim, in this decade, they're going to be behind the curve. And I tend to agree with you. I mean, one of the funniest things I often hear is that investors will say, professional investors will say, is like, it's a big mistake to think that this time is different. Human nature is pretty much, it repeats itself over time. But there's something about what we're seeing now with the high debt levels, as well as the fact that we're transitioning from an industrial era to a digital era, that makes it feel different. I don't know if you subscribe to the sovereign individual thesis and the fourth turning. Have you given any thought to those particular ideas, and how does that fit into your framework?
It's funny you bring it up. They're actually, the very first article I wrote was titled something along the lines of Bitcoin is the big bang to end all cycles. I wrote that one in 2021, and I pointed out, hey, it's really interesting. in the 2020s, we're watching something we have never seen before in human history. We are, like you say, transitioning from an industrial-based society to an information-based society, but we're also watching the unwinding of an 80-year long-term debt cycle. We just talked about that before. There's too much debt in the world. Governments are deleveraging their enormous debt. But we're also at the end of a 90-year fourth turning cycle. So every 90 years, it just seems to be a coincidence that there is an enormous, wave of protests and political change. So if you think 90 years ago, we obviously had the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, and we had the whole FDR Brand New Deal in 1930 and 1940s. If you go 90 years before then, you've got the American Civil War. 90 years before then, you've got the American and the French Revolution. So right now, if you look at this generational 90-year fourth turning cycle, we should be going through a period of significant political upheaval, and we see that everywhere. People have never been more divided than they are today. So we have, and we also have a 50 to 60 year technological cycle. Every single 50 to 60 years since the 1770s industrial revolution, we seem to see a new technological revolution that fundamentally transforms our economy and society. So in 1770, we got the industrial revolution, then you got the invention of trains and railways, and we got electricity and steel, and we got oil and automobile. And then in the 1960s, we got the microprocessor, which gave rise to the internet revolution. And today, looking at that Kondratiev 50-year long wave cycle, we should actually be about to see a new technological revolution. This is a Bitcoin podcast, and most people believe that we think Bitcoin is going to be the technological revolution that transforms society. But there's even more cycles than that. There is also a 250-year revolutionary cycle. So if you look back exactly 250 years ago, we had the French and the American revolutions. But if you look back 250 years before then, we saw the Protestant Reformation, the separation of church and state in the early 1500s. So, and there's one more cycle. I've lost it. I haven't eaten enough food today. Sorry, brother, I forgot it. But I believe that we are kind of living through this era, this decade, where all of these cycles are unwinding together at the same time. And I think that these cycles unwinding the way they are is actually going to be the catalyst to drive Bitcoin's adoption and hyper-Bitcoinization to happen in a fashion that is going to surprise and shock the socks off most people, because everybody thinks, hyper-Bitcoinization is 20 years away, 30 years away, 40 years away. I think that's probably one of the more least likely outcomes. So it's a long way of me to answer, but I certainly do subscribe to thinking that the 2020s is actually different. And I do believe that this time is in fact different. I think I quote that in that article, but yeah, I think we're living for a pretty extraordinary time.
Yeah, man, I feel like a broken record, and people that listen to the podcast might get bored of me saying it, but there's just something that's so obvious to me, that this decade is just riddled with economic inequality, social unrest, populism on both the left and the right. And it just doesn't feel like, it feels like this is a movie we've seen before. It very much mirrors the 30s, at least in living memory. So let's transition now to talk a little bit about something that's more Bitcoin related, if you like. We spoke about these long-term cycles, and one of the things I love about Bitcoin is this ability to really zoom out. We're not sort of focused on the short-term trade. Hey, how's your trade going, bro? This is more about, let's zoom out and have a look at geopolitics. Let's look at macro. But we're recording this now, and as of a few days ago, we see that Binance and both Coinbase have been brought before the SEC, and there's charges laid against them. Give us your thoughts on the way that regulation is happening, at least with regards to those crypto casinos, and perhaps touch on the fact as whether or not you believe there's any political element to the enforcement of specific tokens or not.
I don't. I try to stay out of the whole crypto verse. I did a live stream on it yesterday, and I found an interesting fact. So obviously the United States is attacking crypto. We have this movement called Operation Choke Point 2.0, and the US is trying to debank all of the Bitcoin and crypto industries and businesses. So obviously we saw the controlled demolition of Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank, who were the largest providers of capital and banking infrastructure to the Bitcoin and crypto industry. And now obviously the SEC this week just came after Coinbase and Binance for issuing security tokens. So obviously it's a pretty big week. They're the two largest exchanges in the space. Both of them hold over 500,000 coins on each exchange. So that's a huge chunk of Bitcoin. Somebody at home will be doing their quick maths, but I think that's around 1% of the Bitcoin supply, something like that. So it's a pretty big deal that these exchanges are getting sued. And then somebody will say it's a huge deal because Bitcoin is trading in US dollars and 85% of all the Bitcoin volume around the world is being done in US dollars. So obviously the main way people buy Bitcoin around the world, it's not typically with the Australian dollar cut bucks. It's normally with Tether or, USDC stable coins. They're US dollar stable coins. So people say, hey, it's pretty bad that the government looks like they're going to try and come after Tether. But I saw an interesting fact that said 86% of all the trading volume for Bitcoin and crypto around the world is actually happening outside of the US. So the US can attack Bitcoin and these businesses all they want, and the SEC can sue Binance and Coinbase, the two largest exchanges, but they're simply just going to move offshore. And I actually think it's bullish for hyper-Bitcoinization, because the faster the US regulates Bitcoin, the faster other countries are going to open up their borders and accept Bitcoin. So it's really interesting. Recently, Hong Kong came out around at the same time that the US began attacking this Bitcoin and crypto industry at the beginning of 2023. And they say, we want to be a crypto hub. And that's a really weird thing to say for Hong Kong because they're controlled by China. And China banned Bitcoin in 2021, didn't they? And then this plot thickens when you start thinking about Southeast Asia and what I'm calling Southeast Asia's secret Bitcoin plan, because in China, they're still the world's second largest Bitcoin miner. They have something like 22% of the global Bitcoin hash rate, despite banning Bitcoin in 2021. And they have actually had government officials being spotted at these Hong Kong Bitcoin and crypto events. And there was an article in Bloomberg, and it said, Hong Kong's crypto ambitions get the quiet backing from Beijing. So according to the people who organize these events in Hong Kong, these Chinese officials are okay with what Hong Kong is doing, and they're going to let them do their thing. So, it's the US can attack Bitcoin all they want, but it just looks as if other areas such as the global South, who are actively trying to de-dollarize their economy and wage war on the United States dollar, petrodollar hegemony, look like they're warming up to Bitcoin. And obviously we could talk about Southeast Asia more later on into the pod, but I've written a whole thread on that, and it's really interesting. All of China's neighbors are either mining Bitcoin or buying Bitcoin. So the US can do all they want. Me personally, I'm a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm also a little bit of a freedom maximalist. I don't care what people do as long as they're informed. So if somebody's spewing shitcoin nonsense online, I'll attack them on Twitter and I'll tell them, hey, you're wrong and this is why. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly where I stand with the whole securities thing. I don't really care. I just stand back and say they sure look like securities. I mean, they've got a founder who pre-mined themselves 70% of the token, and everybody holding ETH is praying that Vitalik enables withdrawals for their staked token. So by every metric, they failed the Howey test. But yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of put a bow on this particular section, because the name of the show is the Why Bitcoin Show, and kind of most of the reason I want to talk about things is like Bitcoin. I don't want to just be spouting nonsense about crypto, but I also do want to help people understand the distinction. And I think what you're saying there is pretty much mirrors my personal sentiment. It's like, I don't really care what people want to do with their money. A lot of people like to gamble. People do stupid stuff with money, man. And that's up to them. But the issue I tend to have with crypto is the fact that it's just layered in deceit, false marketing, false advertising. It's kind of riding on Bitcoin's coattails in terms of the idea that it's somehow decentralized, or that it's immutable, or that it's permissionless. Whereas anyone who's done a little bit of digging will know, okay, well, actually, you need 32 ETH to be able to become a validator. So it's not that decentralized. There's all these different layers of centralization. And so from my perspective, it just doesn't make sense. And I don't see why people would be interested in something that is clearly not money. Yeah, I mean, what are the prospects that you'll have something that's genuinely a commodity with a 70% pre-mine? It just doesn't exist. I'm not sure how on earth we're in the situation where Gensler, during his tenure at MIT, is very clearly laying out how Ethereum constitutes security, or in the sense that it passes the Howey test. And then when he's now in power, he seems to be somewhat captured. And again, follow the money at the end of the day. And you think to yourself, who is pulling the strings behind the curtain? Because I can't understand how, despite all the overwhelming evidence, where you see these videos on Twitter where it's literally Vitalik standing there talking about how they're going to make money and how these people get in at a discount, and Joe Lubin and all those guys are talking about it. It blows my mind. And so that's my mission. When I attack crypto, I'm saying this is not what it seems to be. If after you've kind of picked up what it's about and you still want to participate, go for it. But anyway, that's my rant, man, because I worked in shitcoin publications for 2 years, and it felt like I might as well have gone to a third world prison because it was horrific. I just saw the way the sausage is made, and I can't unsee it. And that's what inspired me to do this. So yeah, all right. Let's touch now on your journey out of Australia and initially into El Salvador. I believe you're now in Colombia. I think a lot of Bitcoiners here in Australia, at least the ones that I've spoken to, are sort of raising the alarm bell in a sense. They're saying, all right, we saw what happened during COVID. We saw that the gates shut. We effectively weren't able to leave the country for the most part. And people are very seriously considering like a plan B. And obviously there's challenges associated with people having family and friends here. I know that you had to, unfortunately, leave your dog behind. I mean, so people have to make really challenging decisions if they want to actually go and do this. So talk to us a little bit about that whole process. I know you managed to secure a gig with Mark Moss, which is just epic, but talk us through that whole journey as you sort of left and what your experience has now been initially in El Salvador and traveling elsewhere.
Yeah, it's the best decision I ever made. And it's one that I've thought about for around 2 years. So I didn't have my passport in early 2020 when the madness happened. And like very early on in March and April, I've got screenshots and receipts of me saying, this is never going to be 14 days to flatten the curve. Once you give the government this much power, they're never going to give it back to you. I didn't actually get my passport until around mid 2020. And by the time I was trying to organize my trip out of Australia, I think the borders were about to close, or yeah, it's just a big hassle. So I was stuck in there when the borders were closed for a good year or so, 2020 and 2021. And as soon as the international borders opened in February 2022, I was on one of the first flights out of Australia. And that's because I don't think 2020 was an isolated incident. Once you give the government that much power, they're going to continue to take it. And like we talked about earlier, it's simple economics. It's grade 11 maths. The government has too much debt. How does the government pay back their debt? They're not like you or I. Nobody can freeze the government's assets. The way that the government pays back their debt is they take our assets. They're going to raise They're going to raise taxes on us really high. They're going to raise capital gains taxes on property really high. They're going to print a heap of money, devalue the Australian dollar. And anybody who tries to leave the country, they're going to try and trap them in the country. They obviously don't want the people who are paying the most tax to leave the country. So there's an amazing book that you referenced earlier, Sovereign Individual, written in like the 1997. They forecasted pretty much everything that has happened over the past 20 years. They forecasted the rise of the World Wide Web. That's what it was actually called when they wrote the book in the 1990s. It wasn't called the internet. They said the World Wide Web is going to transform the world. It's going to change the power dynamic between governments and individuals. And the book, The Sovereign Individual, said the technological change that we are living through is going to be a change that actually empowers the individual and not the government. So it's really interesting. Technologies can either be very centralizing or they can actually be very decentralizing. So for example, the Industrial Revolution in the 1770s was very centralizing because for the first time in human history, it brought everybody away from the farms and the villages to work in these enormous big cities and work in the factories, making steel and, making cotton weaving and all of the other things associated with the Industrial Revolution. So all of those technologies were very centralized. But the Sovereign Individual predicted that the technologies of the internet age can actually be very decentralizing. And the book written in 1997 predicted the rise of like the video calls that we are on right now. It predicted phones a decade before smartphones popped up. And obviously it actually predicted, most interestingly, the rise of a digital, anonymous, peer-to-peer private cash, an unstoppable money that the governments could not steal. And it would actually give these sovereign individuals a way to store their wealth in cyberspace where it could not be debased by governments. So again, this was written in 1997. They predicted Bitcoin, and they said when this emerges, the government is naturally going to try to fight all of these sovereign individuals who are now going to leave these massive Western nation states who are, robbing their citizens' money. And the sovereign individuals are going to work online, store their money online, and move to a tax safe haven like El Salvador. 0% taxes for me and 0% any cap gains on my Bitcoin purchases and spends. So it's really interesting. They forecasted that would happen, and they forecasted the world would probably see 100 million sovereign individuals who will leave their Western countries and move abroad. But most interestingly, they forecasted that a way the nation state might try to stop this migration of talent and wealth would be to actually create a biological virus, create a pandemic, and seal the international borders so that these sovereign individuals cannot leave. And obviously I read that book in 2019, and when 2020 happened, that was my framing for looking at the 2020 event and what's going to come next. Because what 2020 enabled was Australia rolled out facial recognition technology all across the country. Obviously, Australia is talking about a central bank digital currency. All of these Western nations are trying to copy what China's doing, and that's create a dystopian Orwellian nightmare where your every transaction will be taxed, traced, monitored, and if the government doesn't like what you're doing, they're going to turn your money off. It's like we already saw glimpses of this when I was living in Australia. I was friends with someone in Brisbane who had their bank account frozen because they went shopping after a curfew and too far away from their own home. So in Australia, most listeners will remember, you had to be within 5 kilometers of your home. And there was some dude in Brisbane that I know personally, I won't name him and shame him, but he had his bank accounts frozen because he was caught spending money from his FPOS card at a shop more than 5 kilometers from his location. So look, it's coming. Our governments are actively working on creating a central bank digital currency, and they're going to seal the borders again. I don't think 2020 was just like the precedent. Now that we let them do it and we've forgiven them, and we've even let them do all sorts of really scary things like reach our bodily autonomy, they're going to continue to do it. So I think we're in the eye of the storm, and the next wave of totalitarian madness is upon us. That's my long answer and reasoning for why I left Australia and why I will remain on the continent of America for the foreseeable future, because I don't want to be trapped in a little Asian island where they were very draconian and totalitarian with their lockdowns and sealing their borders. So I feel like right now I'm not leaving America. I've spent 6 months in the US. I saw 12 different states. I've spent 3 months in Mexico, been there 2 or 3 different times, spent 6 months in El Salvador and 3 months in Colombia, and been to Peru. And I cannot recommend it enough. I think that's the biggest takeaway I want your listeners to get from today's show. If you even had the urge to move, you should do it. It's not as difficult as many people make it out to be. And many of these countries, like Mexico and El Salvador, they're actually safer than Western countries. So when I first told my Australian friends I was going to Mexico, they said, "Oh man, you're dead. You better get a gun. You're going to get shot over there." I was freaking out a little bit because I'd never left Australia when I was in 2022. And I got there, and I spent 2 to 3 weeks in the most dangerous state in Mexico. It's called Guerrero. My buddy was actually given a presentation at Anarchapulco. So it's like this freedom, hippie, liberty-minded conference. And they also have some shitcoin talkers. So my buddy, he's pretty obsessed with Monero. So he was talking at that conference, and long story short, we stayed in the most dangerous state in Mexico. And I thought it was fine. It was just like any other location in Australia. It's so that's a long-winded answer of my journey, and there's lots of different rabbit holes I'm sure we can explore.
Yeah, man, that's such a fascinating story. I think because immediately I think of myself and the trade-offs that I've made by moving to Australia. So primarily one of the main reasons, two reasons why I've moved from South Africa to Australia. One was economic opportunities, and the second was safety. And then obviously in 2020, safety squared, and it went the sort of best part of Australia, which was the relative safety, became the worst part. It was like the worst manifestation of the safetiest culture. Is actually what ultimately made it really difficult to be here in 2020. And then however, when I look on balance and say, would I live in South Africa relative to Australia, knowing and agreeing with everything you're saying, by the way, in terms of the dystopic future that we're looking at, whether it's a CBDC, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's 98% of the population saying, please govern me harder. If it's that case, like, I'm fully aware of all those facts, I still would not live in South Africa in a city because the trade-offs are not worth it. There's just no governance. It's effectively a kleptocratic state where the trade-offs are just not worth it. You firstly have to pay for everything: private healthcare, private schooling. My friend who's living in a really nice area, him and the community have to do all the potholes themselves because the government's just not doing it. You need to organize your own water, get your own borehole, get your own solar. And eventually you're like, what are we doing here? Why am I paying these guys so much money? And you referenced the sovereign individual earlier, and I think it's almost like you're an early adopter of that thesis. And I think there's going to be more and more people like you. I guess what's on your side is the fact that you are young. You don't appear to be too tied down in many ways in your life. A lot of people get set in their ways in terms of their job and their career. And I think also what also helps is the fact that you've got like a job that's digital and the digital nomad life. So the more we've transitioned to a knowledge economy, you can actually go anywhere in the world. And assuming you can earn US dollars, Aussie dollars, whatever the case may be, you've got that geo arbitrage in terms of being able to enjoy a really high standard of living in those countries relative to what you could afford here in Australia, which everyone knows is obscenely expensive. So I like to quote, Catan says this. There's a bunch of people who say this in all different contexts. There's no solutions. There's only trade-offs. This is actually a Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell's my favorite economist, and he talks about that regularly. And so I look at it on balance and say, like, yeah, there's no real solutions here. I think what you've described, I think, is a life that is really appealing to potentially to someone who's at a certain point in their life. I think 10 years ago, I probably would have been right behind you, but I'm sort of now 39, and I'm kind of wanting a little bit more of stability in my life. But I subscribe to everything you've described. I think everything you've described is correct. I'm just going to employ a different strategy in the execution of my plan. So the way I've looked at it, and this is something that I'm potentially going to be talking about at the upcoming Australian Bush Bash in Cairns, is what is your plan B? And talking about different residencies and passports. Because the reality is, once there's a precedent set for essentially imprisoning your population in the country, which has happened, and it's going to happen again, there's no doubt. We just don't know what it's going to be. The only people who were able to leave were people who were citizens of other countries, or unless you got permission, in your case, very lucky. Thanks, government, I'm allowed to leave. So in my case, I could have packed up and gone back to South Africa because I had a South African passport, but I wasn't an Aussie citizen, so I wasn't allowed back in. And so to me, this decade, if you've got wealth, the smart thing to do is to have multiple passports. And it's not an easy thing to achieve, but it's not really helpful to have an Aussie and a New Zealand and a English passport, because those three are more largely aligned in terms of the way their politics and the direction of the country. Andrew Henderson, who's my plan B guy, he would just say, like, those are legacy brands. Those are brands that are sort of riding on their historic coattails. There's going to be countries like El Salvador, which today, for a lot of people, go, well, it probably is a bit of a push, but El Salvador could potentially become like the Singapore of, what Singapore was, say, in the early 50s, like basically just a swampland. So it's such a fascinating journey you're going. And I think everyone here in Australia is sort of cheering you on. But I think what I would also say is, like, I'm sure there are some trade-offs. Do you want to maybe talk about some of the challenges that you've experienced, both, on a personal level or whatever it might be, just to provide a sort of a balanced perspective? I think there's definitely, I think the benefits are clear. What are some of the downsides that you've experienced?
Great question. And I love Australia. Like, I love the country of Australia. It's worth noting, I'm not just bashing on Australia. Like, there's many metrics I look at for, analyzing a location for where I want to weather the 2020s. And Australia ticks lots of boxes. You have an enormous country. So there's lots of places to hide if you need to hide. If we go through hyperinflation, there's lots of arable land. There's lots of farms. There's lots of place to get self-sustainable and get your own food and shake a farmer's hand. I love the culture in Australia. Most people will be able to tell by my accent, I'm a little bit of a bogan. So I love the culture in Australia. And I thought before 2020, where I thought, like, before 2020, there's no way the Australians would just roll over for what they did roll over for. So, like, don't get me wrong, I love Australia, has many benefits. Just for me, the biggest downside was the economic downsides. Government's too indebted, they have to take my wealth. And just having closed borders where you physically cannot leave the country, it's kind of like a deal breaker for me. Like right now, if COVID 2.0 happens tomorrow and I'm in Australia, I can't leave. Borders are sealed. But if I'm in Colombia, all of a sudden I've got a plan B. There might be no flights, but I can get in a car and take my El Salvadorian partner back to El Salvador, and I can just hide out there. Like, I like Latin America because it gives you optionality. It's also an enormous landmass like Australia. It also has lots of I can't say that word. It has lots of land that you could farm on. It has lots of self-sustainable food. They export a lot of food in Latin America, and the weather as well. So, like, there's lots of countries that just far too cold in winter, where if the grid were to go down, you would freeze to death. Or there's lots of countries that are too hot, and if the grid to go down, you would heat to death. It'd be far too hot. So Latin America is actually very similar to Australia in lots of different respects. It's just the one or two big differences is there's lots of optionality and political instability in the region. So I always want to be a stone's throw away from, like, Mexico, who never closed their borders. They were the only country who would take me in 2022, being of my medical status. And obviously you have El Salvador nearby, and lots of other countries in this region are seeing enormous grassroots Bitcoin adoption. And where you see that, I think you're going to see freedom. So downsides for traveling. Obviously, it's very difficult if you have a family, or, like, for me, I didn't have a family in Australia, but I had a dog. So my little baby, I had her for 4 years, and I had to leave her behind and give her to a better home. Obviously, when 2020 happened, I didn't have any online jobs. Like, I was just Bitcoin curious. I was obsessed by it, but I had no online jobs. I had a physical job. I had a home personal training business. I had thousands of dollars worth of gym equipment in my garage. It was a very difficult process for me to come to the decision, okay, I'm going to close my business and focus my time 100% online, just in the attempts to try to get an online job so I can leave this hellhole. Like, that took a year to close my business and find online jobs. So there is certainly lots of negatives. Obviously, traveling can be, it can be annoying to travel to different countries every 3 months. So like obviously, if you're in Australia, you have to pay taxes. So you have to pay 30 or 40% of your income to taxes. Same thing in America, if not higher, 40 to 50% of your taxes if you're in California. But if you're a nomad, you get the positive of actually not paying tax anywhere. So if you spend less than 6 months in most of these countries, you don't have to pay taxes. So, like, that's what I'm doing right now. Yes, it can be a pain in the ass to move your whole life every 3 months or every 6 months. But I like that trade-off of not paying taxes. And it's very easy to actually extend your tourist visa when you're a nomad. So I was in El Salvador, only had a 90-day visa. I paid them $25, and they extended my visa for another 90 days. And all I said was, I am Bitcoiner. I like beaches. I like sun. So obviously the application form is in Spanish, and I didn't know much Spanish at the time. So that was a literal translation. I am Bitcoiner. So, like, governments in this region of the world are very carefree. They don't care. Like, it was a $25 fee and an hour process for me to extend my tourist visa an extra 90 days in the country. Same thing here in Colombia. The partner and I love it here in Colombia. Cost of living is phenomenally cheap. You have no idea. 70% off food, rent, groceries, everything that you would find in a Western country. It's gorgeous, beautiful weather, beautiful Latinas. I better not say that too loud. The girlfriend's in the next room. But if you're a gringo and you're traveling in Latin America, it's amazing.
Don't worry,
So,
dude.
like,
I've seen it myself.
you have to move. Yeah. It's actually, you surprised me, my man. When you said you're 39, I nearly fell over here. You're doing very well for 39, brother. I just wanted to mention that. Yeah. So like there are downsides. I'm trying really hard to think of some more downsides for the listeners. People will say the cost. So yes, you need to buy a flight every 6 months. But I think like if you're paying $2,000 to $3,000 in travel costs a year, that's kind of offset by the $20,000 or $30,000 in taxes that you're not paying. So again, it's a trade-off, but I look at it as a positive. You're just a little bit more uncertain. So obviously when you have a home, you're a lot more certain. But when you're renting, you just don't have the same assurances. But, that's again, it can be a positive or it could be a negative. I mean, obviously, yeah, can you think of any trade-offs for traveling that I haven't thought of? I'm really racking my brain here.
You know what's funny? So like I spent 2 years, obviously we were in lockdown, and I was in northern New South Wales, beautiful part of the country, and just went deep down the rabbit hole on different passports and what are the various options and costs of living. And so, I mean, I think you've captured the vast majority of it. I think the Goldilocks scenario to me is this. You are self-sufficient in the sense that you are financially independent. You've got a location-independent business. You're bringing in hard currency. And that, I mean, sort of anything that is US dollar, Aussie dollar, Canadian dollar, New Zealand dollar, pound, yen, euro, any of those. And the idea for me would be to be in a situation where I can effectively upgrade my living standards by 50 or 100%. And still be able to save a lot more. And that for me is the optimal scenario that personally I would like to achieve in my life. Right now, I'm fairly geo-restricted in terms of the fact that I've got a job, a Fiat job that is very much location dependent. And that business is also very location dependent. You can't just pack up and do that kind of commercial property work anywhere in the world. So the goal ultimately for me would be to be in a situation where I could literally just pack up my wealth, which would be very little in terms of most of it's digital, and I'd be able to just go wherever I want. My personal, one of the things we want to do, my wife and I, is we want to go and live a year in the African bush. I've no intention of ever living in South Africa in any city ever again. It's too wild. It's a wild, wild zone, man. It's like crazy. But the bush is like heaven. And I want to hook up Elon Musk's Starlink, and I want to do podcasts from the African bush for a year and be surrounded by the wild animals and, watch game come to my front door every day. That's what I want to do. So to me, I think I share a lot of your values in the sense of it's freedom, maximalism. I want optionality. And I also just think this next decade is going to be wild. So I think you're an early mover. There's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of downsides. I think it depends, obviously, at that stage in life. People that have got families and kids and homes and jobs and they don't have digital skills, they're going to struggle to translate that into a lifestyle like yours. It was very hard for me because I was a lawyer previously, and then I was in commercial property. So those are very not too much of a lawyer, but the commercial property side is very much a physical, hands-on business. And so to try and transition to having a digital skill that I can take with me anywhere I go in the world, that's been the sort of goal for me over the last, call it 4 years, and what I plan to do for the next 5 or 6 or 10 through this platform. So yeah, I think you've described you've given a reasonable account of both sides of the coin. I want to touch on one more issue before we roll today. I've seen your machine poses in the mirror. You're ripped. And your lifestyle, and you spoke about your gym. You had all your equipment there, and so that's not surprising, man. And I too am a bit of a gym man myself. Talk to us a little bit about your dietary habits, because I think you might be carnivore, and if that ties into Bitcoin at all, because it seems to be a common thing with Bitcoiners.
Jeez, you caught me off guard there. You got me cackling. So I am. So I was a little fat kid when I was younger. I've been lifting weights since I was probably 16 or 17. So Jesus, I'm old. That's 10 years. So 10 years playing around, and I did the whole, dirty bulking regime for the first couple of years of my lifting, and I listened to all the bro science. And obviously when I was doing my major in chemistry at university, chemistry is the core unit that all the medical students have to take. So I also had to do all of your exercise physiology, your nutrition, all of that garbage, all of your Fiat science. And all of that told me, you've got to eat 12 servings of carbohydrates a day. You've got to eat very little red meat and fats. Don't eat those eggs. Those eggs are going to give you heart attacks. Saturated fat and cholesterol is evil. Don't go anywhere near that. So I ate all of that propaganda so hard when, it wasn't until I was probably 20 or 21 when I was properly orange pilled and in Bitcoin for a couple of years that I started noticing all of these other rabbit holes. So obviously when you distrust the government about money, then you also stumble upon the conclusion that you should not be trusting the government for any other aspect of your life. So the government is also lying to you in the education system. They're lying to you in the healthcare system. They're lying to you in the medical system. They're lying to you in every aspect of your life. So I came to that realization about food maybe when I was 21, and I've always kind of been like a little bit of an obsessive person. So when I was lifting weights, I was trying to gain as much muscle naturally as I could at the time. Or, when I was training clients, I was trying to find the optimal routine. And then it was kind of the same thing with my Bitcoin learning obsession. I wanted to learn as much as possible and be functioning optimally for the most amount of time per day so that I could learn the most and be most productive. So then I went down the keto carnivore rabbit hole, and I was shocked with the experiment I ran. I ran like a zero carb experiment maybe when I was 21 or 22, and I was going into it thinking, this is going to be shit. My workouts are going to be trash. I'm going to have no energy. I'm going to get the keto flu, but I'm going to try it for 4 weeks because I try everything. I've tried it all. I've tried high fat diet, low fat diet, vegan diet, high protein diet, low protein diet, done it all. And I can say unequivocally, since I did that low carb experiment 4 or 5 years ago, I eat very little carbohydrates now. So what I'm doing right now is my daily routine. A lot of people ask me what I do daily. I will wake up and obviously drink a shit ton of water. I probably drink 6 or 7 liters of water a day. For my American friends, that's 1.5 gallons. And I'll train at the gym fasted at maybe 12 or 1 o'clock at the day. So I'll have pre-workout, heap of caffeine before the gym. That's my last caffeine for the day at around 12 or 1. And then I'll have my first meal after training at around 2 or 3. And during the day between 2 and 7 p.m., it's just fats and protein. So it's eggs, it's avocado. We have an amazing maid here in Colombia who will cook us up these avocado salads and steak, and she only cooks in animal fat. So obviously went down the seed oil rabbit hole as well, which I'm sure we can get into because I've gone pretty deep down that puppy and I was scared what I found. But again, I'm terrible at giving short answers.
That's why I put you on.
Keto carnivore. Yeah, that's what I tell my guests as well, actually. I full keto carnivore for 3 to 4 years. I wish I'd done it when I was younger. I'm literally 30 to 40% more productive throughout the day. I don't have energy crashes. I'm not fatigued like I used to. My training hasn't been affected after dumping carbohydrates, which for me, after being indoctrinated with Fiat food science, that was the biggest surprise for me. My training is the same. And I mean, I feel really good. I will strategically use carbohydrates in the form of fruits, depending upon what I'm doing at the time. And so if I've gotten a little bit too fat, like I did when I was in Peru, actually, I was traveling with a buddy and he was getting me to eat all the Peruvian food. So I let my hair down for a bit and I got a bit chunky. So if, for example, if I'm trying to cut fat and I'm in a caloric deficit, I will strategically use fruits around my workout. So I'll actually find eating an apple and a banana 90 minutes before I train actually helps me to retain a lot more strength in the gym. And I'll, irrespective of whether I am eating at caloric maintenance or a caloric deficit, I'll always eat fruit at night. I don't know what it is, but going completely zero carb, sometimes I struggle to sleep at night. So I'll always maybe have an apple and a banana and a little bit of fruit salad and yogurt before bed. But I noticed the carbohydrates kind of spike my energy a little bit. And, that's because they're high glycemic index, in 90 minutes, it's in and out of your blood sugar. So I have that at night when I can afford to be like more sleepy.
Yeah. Your experience has been similar to mine, and in the sense that I've only recently gone down the keto carnivore rabbit hole. And I describe my sort of diet as animal based, no seed oil. So I had to ditch the peanut butter and the mayo, which was kind of heartbreaking at the time, but I don't miss it at all. And predominantly meats, and not a lot of fish, to be honest with you, but not a lot of chicken, but tons of beef. What I've been getting into the habit of is just cooking a giant couple kg brisket on the weekend, and then cutting it all up and then just splitting it out for the week. It's a really quick and easy meal, and it's cheap as chips actually. And then in terms of your fruit, I eat any fruit I want. And yeah, it's a good idea before sort of a workout. Otherwise, I feel super flat. But yeah, and then honey's magic stuff. So yeah, it's awesome. It's so funny, these little rabbit holes we go down. And yeah, I certainly do feel the same thing as you in the sense of my energy levels are consistent. And I also don't have those like intense cravings that I used to get. I was like a pizza guy too. Like that was just my thing. And I just don't think about pizza anymore. So yeah, what a game changer. It's something that I'm noticing more and more in the Bitcoin community. And I think you were also onto it a lot earlier than others. Yeah, man, it's been really cool. I haven't even started my day here really. So I got to get rolling shortly. Did you want to give a handoff to any of the listeners before we roll out, man? It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for your time today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I apologize in advance to anyone who firstly made it this long, 1 hour into my ranting and raving for an hour. I'm sorry about that, but I'm also sorry about my internet connection. The internet in Colombia is down today. There you go. There's a downside for Latin America. The internet today is down. Yeah, there you go. Giving Colombia their dues, it's actually the first day in 90 days that I've had an internet issue. I don't know what's going on, but the internet is down. So there you go. It's not all sunshines and big booty Latinas over here in Colombia. There's a few downsides. So dude, thank you so much for having me on your show. If anyone made it this far and they enjoy my ranting and raving, I have a couple of different YouTube channels. So I work full-time at Coin Beast. We're a Bitcoin only educational company. I'm making YouTube videos twice a week and going live on our Money Matters YouTube channel. I'm also releasing my first book this year. So that's just about finished, and I'm actually releasing it chapter by chapter through my Substack. So if you subscribe to that for free, you can read pretty much most of the book. And I have a paid section in my Substack, and I have a little thing in there. Any of the paid subscribers are getting a free copy of the hardcover book when it comes out. Hopefully Q3 2023, but editing for a book is an absolute bitch. And it's my first time. So Q4 2023 at the absolute latest.
Brilliant. Wow, that's a lot of stuff, man. Good on you, hey? And yeah, as I said earlier, we're cheering you on from Australia and watching eagerly to see how things unroll, but really grateful for your contributions to the community. There we go. So thanks a lot, bro. Appreciate your time, and hopefully we get to catch up in person sometime, eh?
Yeah, the same goes to you. I'd love to look forward to meeting you at a conference, and I'm cheering the Australians on from abroad. I really do hope you defeat the government over there. I'm doing my part. I'm not paying another dollar to those thieves in taxes. I'm storing all of my wealth in Bitcoin. So I'm helping to starve the Australian government. But I hope you guys get some more freedom in the interim.
Thanks a lot, Luke. We'll chat again. Cheers, mate.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you got some value out of it. Either way, hit me up on Twitter and let me know what you think. My handle is Dale21M. If you've got any suggestions as to people you think I should be talking to or topics I should address too, I would love that sort of feedback. Otherwise, if you want to support the show, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first is just to share it amongst your friends and family. The more that people hear the message that Bitcoin and crypto are not the same thing, the better. And I want to help people understand that. The second thing you can do is give me a 5-star review on whichever podcast app you're using. Of course, that's only if I deserve it. And last but not least, if you want to stream sats my way via the Fountain app, I'm not going to say no, but it's not expected. Thank you so much for your support thus far. It means the world to me. I appreciate the hell out of you, and the best is yet to come. Much love, friends. I'll see you on the other side.